Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michel Masson, and I'm the CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. I'm absolutely thrilled that you could join us today, and we got quite a good representation of a couple of 100 people with us this morning for an overview of the draft 30-year infrastructure strategy. It is certainly a very important part of our public engagement to have a discussion with you today. So before we commence the webinar, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the many lands on which we all are today and pay my respect to their past, present, and elders and emerging leaders. An American Secretary of Defense put to fame the terms of known unknowns and unknowns unknowns to qualify events which may unfold in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say when you look in the past that with summer bushfires and a global pandemic, we've had quite a few of those events unfolding. Now, far from showing the limits of good planning, it actually demonstrates that a strategy needs to be adaptable and resilient to what may come. So it is certainly in that spirit that IB has researched and consulted widely to prepare that updated strategy that we've got the pleasure of sharing with you today. We wanted it to be a practical plan to address long-term challenges, taking into consideration the rapid acceleration of past trends, but we also wanted to aim at providing short-term concrete responses to stimulate the economy post-COVID. At Infrastructure Victoria, we feel very strongly that we've got a unique opportunity collectively to design a better new normal, harnessing the positive changes that we've seen unfolding, whilst addressing heads-on the challenges we know and preparing for those we don't. So I certainly hope, ladies and gentlemen, that is in that same spirit that you will consider the draft strategy, but most importantly, to be engaged and be part of that conversation. We're very mindful that we've released a draft strategy and are intellectually open to new evidence, constructive criticism, to make sure that we canvass your opinion in what will ultimately be the recommendations reflected in the final strategy, which the Victorian government will have to consider and later on this year when we table it in Parliament. So today you will hear from Jonathan Spear, the Deputy CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. Jonathan will present a short summary of the draft strategy, and then we will open the webinar for questions. Now, I do acknowledge that we may not have in the span of 1 hour of the time to answer to all of your questions, but we will absolutely do our best to cover as many as possible and deal with those that we haven't addressed at a later stage. So just a couple of housekeeping formalities before I hand over to Jonathan. If you can make sure that you mute your microphones. Please type any questions you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and make sure you include your name and your organization. And also for information, please note that we are recording this webinar. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan, who will give an overview of this draft 30-year infrastructure strategy. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Really great to have you here and so many people interested in this briefing on the draft strategy. So as Michelle said, we are recording this webinar, so I'm going to go quite quickly through the context and the key themes of the strategy. You don't need to scribble down everything furiously. Not only will it be recorded, but there's also a copy of these slides are available on the IV website. So we have released our draft 30-year infrastructure strategy. We've got 95 draft recommendations across a whole wide range of sectors, as you will see, and it's looking at both built infrastructure, but also policy reform and investment and change, both immediately now and over the next 30 years. And there's 4 key themes with which we've organised the strategy. One is confronting the long-term challenges that we've got. Second is managing urban change. The third is how we harness our infrastructure for productivity and growth. And last, but by no means least, a strong emphasis on the infrastructure that regional Victoria needs. And so we're open for have your say until the end of February, and we really do encourage you to let us know what you think. So just a little bit of background and context, I suppose. You may be aware that this is the first big update of the 30-year strategy. The first time we produced it was in 2016. And really happily, many of the recommendations that we made in 2016 have been either fully or partially adopted and implemented by government. And I think that's an important thing for you all to think about as you think about being involved and letting us know what you think, because this final version of a strategy will get tabled in Parliament for the information of all political parties and all MPs to inform their positions on policy. And then the government of the day is required to respond and have a 5-year plan for implementation of their response to the 30-year strategy. So this is your chance to influence government policy and have your say through the strategy. So I'll go through the themes and the chapters of the strategy quickly. And what you'll be able to see is that there's those 4 themes that I talked about, and each of them is then broken up into some sub-themes that are important components. So for example, when we're talking about the long-term challenges that Victoria faces, you'll see that we've got a section on how we navigate the energy transition that we're going through, how we respond to climate change, what the ways are that we can embrace the technological opportunities that are relevant to infrastructure, how we stay connected to global markets to have a thriving economy, and how we continue to build a circular economy. And so you'll see that under each of the big themes in each chapter, it's subdivided that way into the important sub-themes, and you'll see that there is both a discussion about why that's important and a summary of the key evidence there, and then we dive into the draft recommendations that we've got. And we're interested in hearing from you both about those themes and chapters that we've identified, as well as the recommendations themselves. So I'll give you a flavour then of each of these. So when we talk about confronting long-term challenges, we've got recommendations around how to accelerate the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles so that we meet the emissions targets and address the need to reduce emissions in the transport sector. We've got about recommendations about how we match the renewable energy generation that is kicking off across Victoria with the transmission and distribution infrastructure that's required. We've got recommendations about how we build in the effects of climate change more concretely into the systems and processes we have for infrastructure investment decision making. We've got recommendations about how we use new technologies to more effectively develop and deliver transport and health and justice services, really building on a lot of the changes in service delivery that we've seen adopted through the pandemic over the last year. And so in each of the sections, we've got some questions that we have raised then that we've identified. You might have other questions and or feedback that you've got, but there's a few that we've identified where we really want to hear from you. So for example, we want to hear from people about what they think the role of the Victorian government is to support the transition towards low and zero emission vehicles. And I should say we're also running some deliberative engagement on that particular topic at the moment with several hundred ordinary community members from across Victoria to have their say. We're interested in what people think about how Victoria can move away from using natural gas and what is the most appropriate way of doing that. Are there areas of natural gas usage where that's not going to be practical versus areas where it might be much more easy and effective to do? And we're interested in people's views about what are the best ways to improve energy efficiency in buildings, because if we know we have more energy efficient buildings, then the infrastructure that we have to generate and transmit energy becomes less demanded upon, and there's a lower level of investment needed. We make better use of that. So that's just a sense of some of the questions we've got in our first section about addressing the big challenges that Victoria faces. The second big theme is around managing urban change. So we have had a big emphasis on much of our research and modelling around the importance of integrating land use and infrastructure planning. And there's a number of ways to do that, what we've identified. One of it is really being much more explicit about that in our public infrastructure planning and publishing more plans across Victorian government key infrastructure sectors. We've identified that there may well be a need to reform infrastructure contributions to pay for infrastructure in areas where you've got growing populations, both in greenfields and in established areas where there is urban renewal going on. And we're really interested in hearing from you about the need for such reform and also what the most effective way of doing it is. We've identified the need to boost the tram network and improve accessibility to the public transport network in areas where we've got growing populations around that tram network. And of course, you know that Infrastructure Victoria has had a long-term research and advocacy theme about better using the transport network that we have through pricing and other signals, such as changing how we pay for our roads and pay for public transport so we make better use of them. So you'll see recommendations there around that. It's not all about transport though, so we have identified the need to upgrade and renew social infrastructure in areas where we have growing populations as well. And so some of the questions that we've raised then that we would love to hear from you about is how do we get the right balance between governments publishing long-term infrastructure plans, but then managing community expectations about their delivery and the timing and content of that, which is a tricky issue. And so what is the best thing so that we can have people knowing what government is planning, but also not removing the flexibility that government sometimes needs to change those plans when circumstances change. We'd love to hear from you about what you think a fair model is for developing infrastructure contributions that raises enough revenue and does it in a timely way so that growing communities have the infrastructure that they need. We would like to hear from you about what it would take to persuade communities about the value of reallocating road space away from things like car parking and to either help car traffic flow or for public transport, open space or cycling, and what your views are on that. So that's just a sense of some of the things we'd like to hear from you in that theme. The third big theme is around how we harness infrastructure to get productivity and growth. And so you'll see that we've got some recommendations around building new infrastructure, so new rail lines, and we're thinking about new roads as well. And we're undertaking modelling around that at the moment as well, which will be released with the final strategy. But we're also interested in things like how do we keep our options open for changes for new infrastructure as we grow. How can we make sure that the delivery of infrastructure in growth areas is being monitored, so is being delivered in a timely way? How can we target more tree canopy in growth areas? And importantly, with Aboriginal communities, we're calling for a process of co-design for Aboriginal community controlled infrastructure, which is really an important part of making sure that there continues to be increasing self-determination for Aboriginal communities and that they're getting the infrastructure that they need. So some of the questions that we're raising that we'd love to hear from you about is, we know that the buses generally are underutilised in Victoria. So how can we practically encourage Victorians to value and make greater use of buses for their public transport journeys? What do you think is the best model to monitor infrastructure delivery in high growth areas so that it is delivered on time? How do you think that the practical ways are that we can increase tree canopies in Melbourne with that have low cover, so that not only do we have better amenity for people who live there, but you also have greater use of active transport, actually a lower demand on our energy system with greater shading on very hot days too. You may have seen that we, like many others, have called for continued increased investment in social housing, and we've identified a target of around 4.5% of the housing stock to be social housing. Do you think that's the right target? And if you do, please tell us, and if not, why not? Those are the sorts of things we'd like to hear from you about that. And of course, we've got a really strong focus on how we develop regional Victoria, both to build on the competitive economic advantages that each region of Victoria has that is distinct, but also to address some of the social disadvantages. And so we've looked at the importance of continuing to enhance digital connectivity for Victorians, both for business, but also for service delivery. We have identified the need to secure long-term funding for maintenance of both road and rail infrastructure in regional Victoria to enhance productivity and to increase safety on those roads. We've looked at the opportunities to use digital service delivery so that remote areas of Victoria can bridge that divide of the distance and still get, really good, timely health services. And we've looked at how can we continue to consolidate and build social infrastructure in regional Victorian areas, particularly service delivery hubs in regional Victoria that address disadvantage and meet community needs. We really love to hear from you about what you think about these priorities that we've identified, whether there's any we've missed, and if you've got any other information or evidence that would make them stronger, more compelling recommendations. And so some of the things that we'd particularly like to hear about for you in regional Victoria is that we've identified the need for having a really clear hierarchy of different roads in regional Victoria for different purposes, so that we can make sure that they are maintained to appropriate standards, but also differential standards according to that hierarchy. We've identified that there might be further opportunity to help develop tourism infrastructure in Victorians' regions, both as we recover from COVID and want a resurgence of domestic tourism, but also when international tourism returns, so that we can continue to have economic growth in the regions. And we're interested in regional communities' views about prioritising their local public transport needs and what the big priorities are there. So as Michelle said from the outset, consultation and engagement is part of Infrastructure Victoria's DNA. And we think it's very important, both for the quality of this final strategy that's delivered to the Parliament, and also to continue to drive some degree of consensus around what the priorities are in infrastructure investment and policy change in Victoria. And so that's why, we are talking to members of the Victorian community all across the state in a really diverse range of people. We're undertaking deliberative engagement with a range of community members on issues like how do we increase the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles. We'd love to hear from you as stakeholders about what you think about the draft strategy. Are there recommendations that are in draft that you think are really important, you really want to back? Are there some that you think maybe that there could be some nuance and improvement to them, and some additional evidence? Or there's some that you just think we've got it wrong and that there's actually a better way to do it, or something we've missed? We'd love to hear from you. And at the same time, we're talking to state, local and federal government about what they think about the draft strategy. So there's a variety of ways that you can take part and join this conversation. We have a number of events that you can register to participate in that are more focused on particular issues or sectors. And you can go to the website and the link is there to both get further information about the strategy, both for each sector and each region, each of those recommendations I've described. You can make submissions to us on the Engage Victoria website, and there's an opportunity to take a survey as well about prioritisation, which is really quick and easy to do. And of course, if you'd like to write us a submission, be it a short or a long one, that'd be really welcome as well. And as I said, if you get on the website, you can see some of the workshops and focus groups that we've got going on over the next month. So when we've got all of that feedback from you, we're going to be integrating it, all that additional input and evidence. We're also undertaking further transport and land use and economic modelling to test some of the recommendations, particularly some of our big transport investment recommendations. You'll see in the final strategy that we'll continue to have refined our estimated costs for delivery of the recommendations and options for how they can be funded. And I said earlier, we're planning to table this strategy in Parliament around the middle of the year. And the more people who have made their input to it, the more of your fingerprints that are on the strategy, the stronger and more compelling it will be. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Really look forward to hearing from you. And we're now going to go to a Q&A session, and really look forward to hearing from you about that too.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that presentation. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Lou Ellen, our Director of Strategy and Policy, who can very rightly be credited as the architect of that strategy that we've had the pleasure of sharing with you today. So please type any questions that you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and don't forget to include your name and your organization. And we'll now be in the good hands of Maddie, who will be our facilitator and will be channeling those questions. Over to you, Maddie.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'm actually going to throw the first question to you, if I may, which is what actions were adopted by governments since the first strategy in 2016?
That's a good question. So we tabled in December 2016 137 recommendations to the Victorian government to consider. And I have to say that it is very nice to see that out of those, 89% have either been completed or are in the process of being completed. And that's a very important stats for you, ladies and gentlemen, to keep in mind, because that means that those recommendations that we're basically offering today to be part of and collectively co-design with us, so that we can collectively feel that we've tabled what it is that we feel the Victorian government needs to consider, is actually a very worthy process. It is not a report that gathers dust. It's actually one for which the government has got to officially respond to, but most importantly for all of us, is actually paying attention to and acting on those recommendations. An 89% hit rate in a couple of years following the first strategy, we feel is a pretty good one, but it's only the beginning of the journey.
Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, I was just muted for a second there. The next question I will throw to Llewellyn, if I may, and this one is from Rob at GHD, and I'm paraphrasing your question, Rob, but basically it's, how does the strategy deal with long-term sea level change and coastal adaptation?
So that is a great question, Rob. So firstly, look, we've kind of acknowledged, and there's some data and evidence in the strategy about prospective sea level rise in the future. And initially, our draft recommendation at the moment is to continue to invest, as the government has been, in increasing coastal protection infrastructure. But one thing we're really interested in hearing from you, and is a discussion question in the strategy, is at what point and under what circumstances do we consider other responses, including retreat? So in the short term, coastal protection infrastructure, is a useful and relatively inexpensive way of dealing with sea level rise. But in the long term, we face some more difficult questions about how to respond to that. So we're really interested in your feedback on that issue.
Thank you very much, Llewellyn. Our next question came from Marianne from Maroondah City Council, and I'll get you to answer this one again, Llewellyn, because I know you spent a lot of time taking this into account, which is, are budget considerations included in the strategy?
So in terms of the budget that the government's just brought down, so the government budget, very much yes so. In terms of the formulation of our strategy, we take existing government budget commitments and commitments to construct as kind of our baseline. So we presume that government commitments will be implemented. And in the strategy, we're really looking at what happens next. So we're concentrating on recommendations that extend and encourage the government to go further than their existing commitment.
Maddie, might just add a little bit to that. Part of the question perhaps is about budget capacity and availability as well. And so we are certainly taking that into account. And while Infrastructure Victoria doesn't seek to duplicate the budgeting efforts that state and local and federal governments and treasuries do, we absolutely are interested in the affordability and delivery of our recommendations. And so anything that people would like to bring to our attention around that would be really welcome. And as I said earlier, we are doing some further costing work, which will and funding recommendations that will be in the final strategy as well.
Excellent, thanks, Jonathan. The next question is to do with high-speed rail, and it comes from Michael from the Committee of Ballarat. And it says, has the report considered electrified high-speed rail to key regional cities? I will get you to answer that, please, Llewellyn.
Thanks. Yes, in fact, there is a section in the strategy that particularly considers that issue, and we've looked quite closely at this issue over a number of years. And I guess the issue we see at the moment is not so much that our trains can't go fast. Our existing trains to regional cities can actually travel quite fast, but what happens is as soon as they hit the metropolitan area, they get stuck behind much slower metropolitan trains and can't have a straight run into the city. So what our recommendations have gone to is in fact continuing to untangle the regional lines and having enough capacity on the lines once we hit the metropolitan edge so that regional trains are able to have a smooth run into the city. And that will actually make regional trains much faster and deliver many of the time travel benefits that are often proposed for high-speed rail, but in fact we can achieve many of those benefits with our existing trains if we can give them a straight run into the city.
Thanks, Llewellyn. And I know we did have a few regional media questions about that when we were rolling the strategy out. The next question comes from Paul Brumby, and it covers a couple of issues, but perhaps you can touch on them briefly, Llewellyn, which is many of our communities do not have potable reticulated water and sewerage, as well as fast internet and mobile services. And how does the strategy address these issues?
So, firstly, thank you for a regional question. We're very proud of some of our regional work, and thank you again to all of our regional stakeholders who've contributed to that work. So on both of those issues, we have made considerations in the strategy, and we do think there is room and have made a recommendation about improving regional connectivity and particularly the regional resilience of internet systems and communication systems. And you know, the 2020 bushfires, the 2020 bushfires, the years are getting mixed up, gave us ample demonstration of the critical importance of digital infrastructure in the regions, not only for emergencies, but we also see increasingly through the pandemic, for example, that digital infrastructure has become crucial for as an economic lifeline for the regions. So we think there is more to do on digital infrastructure, and we think there's more to do on water infrastructure as well. We're very aware of the increasing scarcity of water across Victoria, and we think there is room for governments to consider more options in water sources, as well as continuing to invest in protecting that asset.
Okay, thanks very much. We're covering quite a few topics in this session, which is great to see. My next question comes from William, who says, are there any parallels between the strategy and DELP's 20-minute neighbourhood and city plan, which for those who are not aware is about having a lot of infrastructure close to people, where people live within 20 minutes in the city? I'll direct that to you again, please, Llewellyn.
Okay, so firstly, yes, and we've looked at quite a number of issues about how local communities function and how we can improve the connectivity and amenity of local communities. So that goes to issues like cycling and walking infrastructure and making sure that people have those direct active transport connections to the facilities in their local communities. It goes to the operation of the bus network and ensuring that, for example, activity centres beyond the CBD have good bus connections so people can get to employment in their local areas, rather than all of the focus being on getting people to the CBD. And we also have a draft recommendation looking at the delivery of infrastructure in the suburbs, and actually being able to have good monitoring and advice to government about what is missing in local communities and when and where it needs to be built.
Excellent, thank you very much.
If I may add something to that, Maddie, because I'd certainly be very interested to hear from all of you also on the conundrum that we're all facing at the moment post-COVID, which is the very strong focus on living locally in the 20-minute neighborhood, and at the same time doing everything we can to bring back some life into the CBD, and that all too importance of the city recovery. That's a conundrum, and this is one that we are talking about with our colleagues from different departments and agencies. It is definitely one that we've got in mind in the context of this draft strategy leading to the final strategy, and it's one that I would encourage you to keep some thinking of in the context of bringing us with your views and some ideas that may enable to get a good balance between those two considerations.
Thanks, Michelle. Jonathan, I might get you to answer these two questions that relate to energy infrastructure. The first is, how does the strategy deal with the phasing out of the oil and gas industry in Victoria, and is that actually feasible by 2050? And the second related question is, with the chronically constrained electricity infrastructure in many parts of the state, how does the strategy deal with electricity infrastructure and the adaptation of it?
Yeah, they're two really great questions, Maddie, but some of it's very short term in terms of how do we make the great use of the regional economic opportunity for energy generation. So it's certainly part of it. Let me start with the last question first. So what we know and what we identified and seen through talking to regional communities in our research is great opportunity for renewable energy economic development that contributes towards a net zero state. But the ability to coordinate and connect that investment is the challenge that we're all dealing with at the moment. So we've made two recommendations in particular. One is about designating and coordinating renewable energy zones, where the government takes a role in facilitating the timing and investment location of those renewable energy zones. And that's something that New South Wales has also been doing. So we're recommending that, and the government has already started to move towards that. And so designating exactly which zones they are and where and when is something we think needs to be proceeded with. Then there's the connectivity of the transmission infrastructure, which is a real priority. And so we've made recommendations about delivering that connectivity so the renewable energy can be transmitted from its point of generation to its point of use. The other question about the future of oil and gas in Victoria is a really interesting one. And so we've got a couple of recommendations that are relevant to that, but we would very much like to hear from stakeholders about it. We've identified that there's a current policy that effectively means that when you deliver a new housing estate, there is a requirement to deliver gas connections to that housing estate. And we're really questioning the wisdom of requiring gas connections, which locks in emissions from those gas connections for some decades to come. And so we're recommending that not be a requirement, and we're also recommending that there be continued review of the role of gas in the Victorian energy mix. Now, we know that there's reviews that DELP are undertaking with the gas industry roadmap, and also Infrastructure Victoria have recently been asked to provide advice to government about the long-term role of gas in the energy mix of Victoria. And if you're interested in that, there's some bit more detail of that on the IV website. Of course, the other part of gas and that industry is the role in the transport sector. And one of our first recommendations is around the move towards low and zero emission vehicles. And so we've made recommendations about the government taking a lead in the government fleet and public transport, in taking up low and zero emission vehicles, in incentivising the freight industry to do the same. And then we've are currently deliberating with community members from across the state about what they think other steps are that should be taken to accelerate the uptake of those low or zero emission vehicles. So got quite a bit to say there, and we're really be interested in if there's issues we've missed, or if people have got firm views about the future of oil and gas in the energy mix and its place in infrastructure.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. I might throw the next question to Llewellyn, which is about regional rail, and it comes from Philip at the Victorian Rail Futures Institute. Llewellyn, is there any interest in extending standard gauge in the regions with a view for rail moving more freight in Victoria?
Look, we would really be interested in hearing more about the extension of standard rail. Our current recommendations really go to setting out a long-term vision for freight by rail in the future. And what we've seen is kind of a very stop-start approach to maintenance of the freight rail network. So we've really recommended the government in draft form that they need a much longer term plan and a much longer term funding bucket in order to maintain that network in the future. Because what we are seeing is that there is a reluctance of the private sector to invest in the facilities required to use the freight network because there is no long-term government commitments to maintaining and extending that network. But we would be really interested in hearing more about both the rail gauge, but the future of the rail network more generally.
Maybe if I can add to that, the other component that we're recommending is around the Murray Basin Rail. And it's obviously been subject to some review. And so our recommendation is post that review for the update of the business case to be completed. And then for the delivery of that updated, scoped Murray Basin Rail Plan.
Thanks very much. Michelle, I might throw this question to you as we haven't heard from you in a little while. Does Ivy have a position on the configuration or capacity of Melbourne Airport rail link in terms of its potential impacts on broader long-term metro rail system capacity?
So as Llewellyn mentioned it at the beginning, the way IV undertakes the long-term strategic planning is to take any committed and announced project as part of the reference case. So that's a way of responding to the question by saying that we haven't looked at the Melbourne Airport rail link in detail, but we've taken it into consideration in our reference case. Where we do add value, of course, is that considering those as part of the future landscape, our recommendations will aim at complementing those. In other words, taking into consideration that in the next 30 years, we're going to have the Melbourne Airport rail link, what more do we need from a land use point of view and from an infrastructure point of view in order to bring the services and accompany the various growth areas and the various developments that we'll see. So keep in mind that our recommendations today and those that you'll see in the future, especially after we have completed in the next couple of months extensive modeling and costing on some major transport programs, which will be reflected in the final strategy, this work will enable us to look at assessing the relative merit and prioritization of those transport programs that will complement what has already been announced and what we take as granted that will be delivered, like the Melbourne Airport rail link.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I'll give this question to Llewellyn as it's another regional one, and it comes from Johnny, and it's to do with how does the strategy deal with bushfire in regional areas and the need for early smoke or fire detection infrastructure?
Look, great question, and we are very aware that a number of the inquiries and reviews into the 2020 bushfires are now coming to fruition. When we were preparing the draft, an awful lot of that was still in progress. And we wanted to make sure we had full knowledge of, I guess, all of that, detailed work from both Royal Commission's inquiries and reviews before we produce the draft. But we're actually really interested in hearing from communities in light of many of those inquiries and reviews, which infrastructure recommendations should we, include and piggyback, if you like, off some of those inquiries to elevate into the 30-year strategy. So very interested to hear views about smoke detection infrastructure and indeed any infrastructure consequences that have arisen from the experience of the 2020 fires. We have particularly made a recommendation about the resilience of digital infrastructure, but I suspect there are a number of other things that we would like to include in response to that event.
If I could add to that, we've also got a recommendation in the draft strategy about safe community spaces that people can go to in periods where it's either very hot or very smoky. And this was raised with us through our extensive consultation with communities so far. And that's not meant to be a supplement to other emergency management safety arrangements. But what was brought to our attention was when it's really, really hot and you're in a city, well, you can go to a shopping centre. And you can get away from that heat or away from that smoke. Regional Victorians don't always have that option. And so using existing community facilities, but making sure they're upgraded and prepared so people can go there in very hot or very smoky conditions like we saw in the 2020 fires is something that is a draft recommendation at the moment.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. The next question is in relation to nature-based tourism, and it comes from Nat, and I'll throw that one to Llewellyn as well. In delivering better nature-based tourism in our regions, they'll require more land use and development of tourism infrastructure in small communities. So how do we reconcile this to deliver meaningful eco-development opportunities? And that's come from Nat at Urbis.
Fantastic, thanks Nat. It's a great question and goes to a couple of the draft recommendations in the draft strategy. So I guess firstly just to say we're really aware that compared to other parts of the country, there's a lot of room for growth for regional Victoria in nature-based tourism. We have some amazing nature-based tourism assets and there is quite a lot of potential for growth in the future, and particularly once we return to international tourism, but even in the shorter term for domestic tourism. But the evidence we've looked at suggests precisely what Nat mentions, which is that we don't have the suite of attractions easily accessible to build the foundation of that tourism industry. So we have both noted, I guess, the government's recent investments. So the government has actually made quite a large number of investments in regional tourism infrastructure in the last budget as part of the COVID recovery. But we think in order to guide that over the longer term, the government should produce a nature-based tourism strategy and also look at the options to change land use. For example, providing slightly longer leases in select national parks, or indeed change other land use around some of those natural assets in order to help facilitate new tourism infrastructure in the regions.
Great, thank you very much, Llewellyn. Jonathan, I'll throw this one to you. It's from Mikey, and it's to do with national employment and innovation clusters. What do you see as the strategic priorities for activating and developing Melbourne's national employment and innovation clusters, and what role do you see for them in Melbourne's future?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've thought about that pretty hard actually, and you'll see that coming out in some of the modelling we've done as well about the levels of demand for accessibility to those clusters. So it's a little bit relevant to the earlier discussion too about the balance between the role of the CBD and the 20-minute neighbourhoods objectives. So we think that continuing to develop the National Employment Innovation Cluster services, for those of you who aren't aware of what they are, so there's a number of centres around Melbourne that should be familiar to you. Places like, say, Sunshine, Footscray, Box Hill, for example, which are designated areas for employment and innovation growth. And we know that there's a few different things that are involved in getting those humming, and not all of them are infrastructure related, but infrastructure plays an important part. And we've particularly looked at some of the transport accessibility requirements, and we've identified that in some cases, the road and rail connections to those locations aren't as good as they could be. And sometimes it also involves things like public transport connections like buses, so people can get easily from where they live to these clusters without having to use the radial system of going all the way into the city on the train and all the way back out again. So you'll see some recommendations that we've got there about improving road connections to those areas, and improving public transport, especially bus connections to those areas, which can be delivered really quite quickly and flexibly. So we think that's important. The other thing that we're going to be looking at very closely as we do our further transport modelling, which will come out with the final strategy, is the degree to which they help with the accessibility to those national employment innovation clusters.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. I did have a question from Marianne, which was just around, is there a template for submissions? And I can answer that for you, Marianne, which is yes. If you get on the Engage Vic website, there's a form that will help guide you through writing a submission for the strategy, because obviously that can be helpful in making it a little bit easier for you, and we welcome as many submissions as possible. We will also be responding to any questions that we didn't get to today. So if you haven't had your question answered, our team will respond to you when we can in relation to that. So thanks very much for all your questions. I have another one now for Llewellyn, which is, how does the strategy respond to critical waste infrastructure and to changing technology options in that space? And that's coming from Peter at Cardinia Shire Council.
I'm actually going to throw that to Jonathan because I think he's going to give a better answer.
Perfect.
Oh, the modesty. Well, Peter, good question. As you might be aware, there's been lots of good work done on recycling and resource recovery infrastructure by local governments, federal government, state government, DELP, Sustainability Victoria, and the waste and resource recovery groups over the last year. And as part of that, Infrastructure Victoria delivered some detailed advice about the sort of infrastructure that we need to improve recycling and resource recovery, which was published last year. And that was a feed into the government's Recycling Victoria strategy that is released. So what you'll see is a dedicated section in the strategy about the circular economy. And that picks up many of the key themes that, if you're familiar with our advice to government on waste and resource recovery infrastructure. So we're identifying the need for continued and accelerated investment in key areas where we know we need to get going, where if we don't actually get to recover, recycle and have good end markets for those recyclables, we're going to end up with stockpiling again and missing the big economic and environmental opportunities and employment opportunities from that. So that's things like plastics, paper and card, for example. And so you'll see that, so we've got recommendations about that short term, but also that there's big opportunities in regional areas for economic development too. The other part that you'll see is that we've identified, partly to your point, a big question about changing technologies, that the need to continue to have a clear policy about the role of waste to energy, and that we are going to still need to have some landfills as well, but we want to be diverting as much as we can. And so clear policy planning and roles for those bits of the waste stream that can't be recycled and recovered. And then the other part of it is, continued calls for building the end markets for recyclable material, because we know that is critical to be able to actually have removed stockpiles and a strong recycling and recovery industry, which that infrastructure just sits in the middle to support, really. And do want to acknowledge the really important role that local government has played in this throughout, in terms of supporting the change and being involved in it, and its critical role in the siting and support for resource recovery infrastructure.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I've got one more question coming your way before we throw back to Michelle to close the webinar today. And it relates to one of your favourite topics, I know, which is electric vehicles. And so how does the strategy approach the shift towards zero emission vehicles, taking into account current affordability of electric vehicles and the scarcity of charging stations, particularly in regional areas? And that comes from Matt.
Yeah, good question, Matt. Let's start with a problem, I suppose, which is, it's a really well-acknowledged problem, which is that in many sectors in Victoria, we're on a path to reduce emissions, which is helpful towards the goals that the government has set about net zero emissions. The transport sector is not in that position, unfortunately. The transport sector is one where emissions have increased in Victoria, and that's pretty similar in many other areas around the globe as well. So if we are going to meet the targets that government has set and actually get many of the benefits to society and the environment from zero emission vehicles, we need to get cracking in terms of the uptake of that. Now, not all of this is within the grasp of the Victorian government. Victorian government can't really change, the cost of batteries, which is a key driver, right, for the cost of electric vehicles. But what we can do is take some steps to really be first movers on this in terms of getting low and zero emission vehicles into the fleet. So we have identified that being a key opportunity for Victorian government fleet and public transport, especially buses, to move to zero emissions. We've identified the need to continue to incentivise especially freight access, where we know that community approval and support for freight is often related to noise and emissions issues, and going to zero emission or low emission vehicles is part of that. Matt, I think you raised the issue about charging. So there's actually quite a lot of investment undertaken at the moment through state, federal and private sector investment. So we haven't called out charging infrastructure as a recommendation, because a lot of that is underway. But one of the things we are doing is talking to the community about, well, what else is important about the uptake of zero emission vehicles? What would be the things that would matter most to people to incentivize that? And then the other thing on zero emission vehicles is that you're probably aware that the government has announced that they will introduce a distance-based charge for zero emission vehicles. And that's something that is in accordance with work that we and others have done. But the important nuance is that our recommendation also calls for removal of many of the upfront fees that zero emission electric vehicles would pay. So removal of some of the registration and other fixed charges up front before you even drive a kilometre on the roads, and instead paying through a distance-based charge. And we think that removal of those upfront fees is likely to be influential in people's decisions about taking up electric and other low emission vehicles. That's something we'd really love to hear from you about. And if you've got other ideas about how we can increase the uptake of electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, I'm really happy to hear it. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks very much. And I'll just hand over to Michelle now to close the webinar. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will finish off the way I started by really launching a call to arms to all of you to be part of that conversation, to be part of that engagement, because we certainly have an opportunity all together as Team Victoria to put our heads together and really co-design what that better new normal can actually be. We've got this unique opportunity through the process that Infrastructure Victoria is going through at the moment, and we absolutely would love to hear from you and to have you part of that conversation. We've got this unique opportunity to let the Victorian government, through the 30-year infrastructure strategy, what we collectively think should the priorities be, and really let them know what our collective thinking is. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. We certainly take continuous improvement very seriously in Infrastructure Victoria, so we will send out a short survey in the next few days. If you could take the time to fill it out, that would be very appreciated. You also get the email address to which you can address the questions that you would have loved to see being addressed this morning, but which we haven't touched. And please make sure that you visit our website to lodge your submission, to put your comments, or dive into the very deep library of reports and resources that we've accumulated over the years of the work that IB has done, and which is here available to all of you to inform your thinking, to inform your considerations. We are a transparent, evidence-based organization, and the wealth of reports accessible on our website demonstrates this profound value. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Please stay safe, and we're certainly looking forward to seeing you in the future and get your views on the 30-year infrastructure strategy. Thank you.